Today's scripture is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out. And there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So the church is much during the week, much like any other workplace that you might go into, meaning that we often find ourselves getting into somewhat random conversations about random things. And if you don't know, during the week, most of the people who are here are the folks who actually work downstairs in the preschool. So we end up talking a lot about like preschool and young child things. And recently, I was getting a bit of a lesson from Carrie Ann about the importance for children to learn how to crawl, and that they really do need to learn how to crawl before they walk. It's not apparently good if they skip straight to walking. I don't know why. I didn't ask. But apparently it is important that they do in fact learn how to crawl. And so when we were talking about that, I couldn't help but think about my kids, and especially Gavin. Because Gavin, being the firstborn child, waited a while before he decided to learn how to crawl. Vivi learned to crawl very early, mostly to chase her brother. Gavin took a little bit more convincing, and what finally convinced him, I think, to figure this thing out was not his love for his parents or anything like that, or not to chase another child around because he didn't have that. It really was his love of the vacuum. And that kid loved the vacuum, and yes, that actually is Gavin, believe it or not. And he was fascinated by the vacuum, by the noises it makes. It had a light on it. He would get very excited anytime the vacuum came out. And I remember the day when he was sitting there on all fours and finally figured out how to get himself moving forward enough, and then really just began to chase the vacuum all around, which was cute the first time. And then it came rather annoying. You had to learn to make sure that Gavin wasn't in the room, otherwise you'd be tripping over your baby the whole time you were trying to get your housework done. Now, I find that interesting because you would think, that given the loud noise that it makes and all that sort of stuff, it would be reasonable, and in fact, our kids, who no doubt are, actually afraid of the vacuum, because again, it makes a lot of noise, and it moves around somewhat randomly, and has this big light on it. It might be scary. Gavin, however, was a different kind of kid, apparently. And instead of being scared about the vacuum, he was really curious about it. And if you think about it, for the first few years of our lives, everything we learn and everything that we figure out how to do, whether it's learning to walk or crawl or whatever it is, really is all motivated by one thing, right? Because little babies are something consistent. And the consistent things that little babies are and toddlers are is curious. right? They're curious about their world. They're curious about how it works. They're curious if this metal thing will fit into the outlet or not, which is why we have to do things like baby-proofing our houses. Because what we are really doing is we are limiting their ability to be curious, because they will be curious to the point of hurting themselves because they don't know yet what's going to hurt them. Curiosity is actually a required part of growing up. It's really what makes us us. And really maintaining our curiosity about the life and the world and all that sort of things is really what helps us out in school and in life moving forward. Now, there's a couple different reasons, and sociologists have studied this, and there's a couple different reasons why we are curious. And they kind of lump it into two buckets. First is curious out of interest. There's something we want to learn how to do. There's something we want to be able to do that we don't yet know how to do. The other day, for whatever reason, after clicking around the internet for a while, I got really curious about how you make chocolate lava cake. And I found out. It's not that hard. But it was an interest, and it's something I wanted to do, and I thought it might be nice if I learned how to do that, and it would probably, hopefully, taste good, and it did, right? So I was interested in it. I was interested in it because I thought there may be some good consequence of discovering or learning about it. The other time we get curious, they bucket it under deprivation, which is it's basically the opposite of interest. It's when there's something that isn't quite right in life. There's something that maybe hurts. There's a pain that we have. There's some suffering that we're going through, and we want to figure out how to get on the other side of the pain or the suffering. Either one can motivate us to be curious, but the way to get through, the way to learn the thing we want to learn because we think it's going to feel good, or the way to learn the thing we want to learn or discover because we think it's going to help us not feel bad, is the same. The goal is to become curious about what could be, how things could be different, and then figure out how do we get from where we are to where we want to be. We've talked about curiosity around here several times before, because I continue to maintain that the human being's ability to be curious really is our superpower. It's the thing that helps us figure out life. It's the thing that helps us figure out the world. It's the thing that led us to have all the amazing advances in technology and all that stuff we have today. Curiosity is actually a required part of human life and human existence. We were made to be curious about the world, and we don't really work in the world if we're not curious. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us as we are reading this very interesting story of the birth of Christ that something very curious happens, which is the arrival of these strangers from out east. This is one of those amazing places where the Bible is incredibly non-helpful and non-descriptive about what actually is going on. Right? Because for whatever reason, apparently it didn't actually matter where they were from. And in fact, there's a decent chance that nobody actually really even understood necessarily where they were from. The only thing that mattered to the story is they were from not there. They were from somewhere else. They were from somewhere exotic. They were from somewhere far away. Which is why, if you look at like your manger scenes, the wise men are always the ones dressed very differently from everybody else. So the wise men arrive from the east, and they're looking for a king, and they go to the first logical place one would go to look for a king, which of course is in the capital in Jerusalem. Now, the wise men are interesting. The Greek word that we translate now as wise men is actually magi. So that's kind of how we Englishized the original Greek word. So you've heard them called the magi. That's why, because that's the actual Greek word under it. And yes, it's the Greek word magi does have the same root as magic and magician. Magi actually show up in other places in the Bible, especially in the book of Acts. There are a couple people that are described, and the same word is used, magi, but in the book of Acts, we actually translate it as magician. Most English translators, though, do not translate the word magi in the birth story of Jesus to magician, because I think for us today, magicians are inherently untrustworthy, right? Their whole profession is to trick you about something, right? I mean, and I love a good magician. I grew up, with David Copperfield and all of that. I watched the Statue of Liberty disappear. It was super cool. Some of you, okay, come on. But that has a connotation for us today that the Bible translators don't really want it to have. So they either leave it as magi or they translate it in the alternate form, which is wise men, which would have been more at the tune at the time. Now, chances are, as best we can figure out, the Magi were from the East. They were probably from the Persian Empire, and they were probably Zoroastrian, which is a fun word to say. And the Zoroastrians were a community, were kind of a religious group that popped up in about 500 years before Christ. And it popped up about the time that the Jews, God's people, were actually leaving the Babylonian exile, and they cropped up in the same place. So there was actually some overlap between the Jews and the beginning of the Zoroastrian movement in the same place. So it actually sort of makes sense that they would have a prophecy about this king far away, because this is not going to be their king. They are from somewhere else. When they say the king of the Jews, they mean other people. This is somebody else's king. And yet, they come and they say, we're coming not only to come and bring these gifts for this king, but to worship him. We translate that word as worship, but that also has an additional meaning of really be almost subservient to. So you can imagine that when Herod, who understands himself to be the king of the Jews, is told by these strangers from somewhere else that are no doubt dressed very differently from him and speak probably different language than he speaks, with this kind of vague prophecy about a new king, that might concern Herod. And he is very concerned. And so when they say, not only are we here, we want to meet the new king, but we are here to worship him, that is doubly concerning to Herod, because they are coming from a place that does not currently worship the king of the Jews, Herod. And that is something that no doubt he wouldn't mind happening. So he basically does what he does. He sends for the teachers and the law and says, where is this going to be? And they say it's in Bethlehem. And they said, okay. And then he calls them together in secret, as we said, and then he flat out lies to them. And if you keep reading the story in Matthew, you will see how much he lied to them. But he flat out lies to them and said, you go. He basically deputizes the wise men to become his spies. He says, you go and figure out where this new king is, and you come back and let me know so that I can go worship him too. And of course, if you read the story, that's not what Herod has in mind at all. Herod isn't actually really all that curious about Jesus or who Jesus is or this new king. Herod is just simply afraid. He's afraid about what this could mean. He's afraid about what's going on. And he is acting really not out of his curiosity, but he is acting out of his fear. If he's curious at all, it's that he's worried he will be deprived of something. He will be deprived of his place in his station in life. He will be deprived of who he is and all of the privileges that he has. So Herod chooses to act out of fear. Thankfully, Herod is not the only one that the wise men talk to. They go and they talk to somebody else as well, and of course the other person they go to talk to is Mary and Joseph when they go to present their gifts. Now, we don't actually know, if you've read in there, we don't actually know how Mary responded to these three random strangers dressed weirdly, giving, their baby daughter shampoo, essentially. As Christy so amazingly pointed out during our children's message, these are a bit odd. These are odd children's gifts, right? You'd be like, really? Not like, how about diapers? A stroller? But I guess that hasn't been invented yet. Whatever. But we do know the kind of person that Mary is already from other things that have already happened to her. If you go back and think about when the angels present themselves to Mary, and they give her the message, Mary has a very interesting response. And I think we talked about this a couple of years ago when we talked about Mary. One of the things we have to keep in mind when we're talking about Mary is that when the angels come and say, hey, by the way, you're going to have a kid, what they are inviting her to do is to become an unwed mother, a very young unwed mother. It was actually less socially acceptable to be a young unwed mother then than it is today, and it's not exactly socially acceptable today. Mary knows that what the angel is asking her to do will not be easy, and what they're asking her to do will come with hardship. It will come, with a lot of rumors. It will come with a cost. Mary, no doubt, has seen other people in the village that she lives in go through something similar. So Mary doesn't immediately think that what the angel is asking her to do is necessarily a good thing. In fact, she knows that it's going to be very, very hard. And yet, when the angel comes and says to Mary, "Greetings, favored one," the famous passage, "you will have a child," she responds, we are told, by saying Mary was perplexed and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. She wondered. She didn't immediately react out of fear, even though no doubt she had it. She got curious about what this could be and what this could mean, and then was open and continued to listen to what else the angel had to say. She did not immediately shut the angel down and say, "Nope, not interested in that, move on." She pondered what sort of greeting this might be, and in her curiosity continued to listen. And in fact, later when she is told, "You will be pregnant and have a child," she even asks a question. Not an evasive question, but a clarifying question. She's like, "How can this be? Or I haven't done the thing that you do to make babies." Even then, they knew how that worked. And so they go and they explain it to her. She was curious again, and the angel explains, well, the Holy Spirit is the one that will do. And after that, after Mary indulges her curiosity and gets the questions answered and comes to it with an open mind and an open heart, she agrees. She says yes. Mary is a good example of what it is that we are called to do, how we are called to confront interesting, unique, and unexpected things that pop up in our lives, even if that thing that pops up initially causes us to have a little bit of fear and dread. And because Mary does what she does, Mary gets to be the mother of Jesus. Herod, however, will walk a different path because he is not able to open his hearts and minds up to something interesting that might be happening around him, and instead chooses only to act out of fear. Human history is actually full of many times when we as people were given this option, and sometimes, even as people, we chose well, and sometimes we did not. One of the things that we lifted up in Joys and Concerns today was a joy that Jay helped us organize people to go ring bells for the Salvation Army. Now, if you don't know, the Salvation Army is currently in the United States the biggest non-governmental charitable organization in the United States, right, in terms of dollars and work that they do. So much so that the Salvation Army really is seen as a nonprofit that does work around homelessness and they have their thrift stores and all of that we can actually sometimes forget that the Salvation Army is at its core a church. And it is a church, by the way. It is, in all of the ways that we are a church, and in fact, even maybe a little more so than we imagine. Salvation Army actually was founded by William Booth in 1865 in England. William Booth was a Methodist pastor. He was an ordained Methodist pastor in the Methodist Church in England, who started a outreach mission for people living on the streets and in the margins, and got really concerned about what was going on there, and decided at some point that the Methodist Church at that time in that place, wasn't caring about it enough. And so he started his own thing that eventually would break off and become its own thing, but maintain its Methodist and Wesleyan roots. So from a doctrine perspective and what a church belief perspective, Salvation Army is actually very much Wesleyan in the same way that we are, and in many ways broke off from Methodism for the same reason that John Wesley himself would leave a movement against the Church of England, because of course what was John Wesley known for? His care and concern for the poor and the needy and the widow and his desire to serve them. And he thought at his time, 100 years before, the church wasn't doing enough about it. So here we have William Booth 100 years later with the same concern, and honestly kind of ends up doing the same thing. And so he sets up what eventually he becomes the Salvation Army. And they adopt this whole thing, and if you don't know, like they actually do have like ranks. You join, you can become like a private and all this sort of stuff and all those sorts of things. But they continue to be a church, and they continue to worship. But they have their what they call their three phrases, the thing that they care about the most at the time, and they talk about soup, soap, and salvation in the beginning, and in that order. What they recognize is it's really hard to talk to people about their souls when they're hungry. It's really hard to talk to people about, how much God loves them when they're dirty or naked. And so William sets out to create a movement that will care about those things for people. And because he does this, the first group of people he attracts are, again, very similar to what the first people that John Wesley attracted to the Methodist movement as a whole. He attracts people to this church, this movement he's doing. He attracts the alcoholics and the morphine addicts and the prostitutes and all of those folks. Now, we today, no doubt, when we see somebody ringing the bell outside of Hayes or Walmart or whatever it is, if you're anything like me, that's the moment you realize that you never carry cash. And you don't understand why the red bell doesn't have like a card swiper on it. Like, why? Come on, guys, it's 2023. QR code, give me something, right? But we don't often think about or necessarily even take issue with what it is they do. We say, of course, those are things you should do. Of course, you should take care of the hungry. Of course, you should take care of the needy. Of course, you should clothe the naked. That's just what it is. Well, when the Salvation Army first started, that's not necessarily how everybody responded. And in fact, people had such a strong response to this very early movement that was organizing all of these people who had previously not been organized and gathering around these people together that most of, kind of nice society would like to pretend and forget existed. And they started doing things like, having marches and rallies and gatherings of all of these folks. And this is challenging to a lot of the other people of the time. So much so that within about 4 or 5 years of the initial founding of the Salvation Army, another organized group is formed called the Skeleton Army. It's a real thing. It happened in England. And the Skeleton Army's job, as they took it upon themselves, was basically to follow behind the Salvation Army when they did their marchings and when they did their marches or when they did their gatherings, and basically like throw rocks and dead rats and all kinds of crazy things to disrupt what they were doing. Again, very much like early Methodism when people used to throw bricks at John Wesley. In this case, it was an organized movement of people basically in opposition to this crazy radical thing that was happening in the Salvation Army, this crazy idea that maybe we actually should take care of each other. When God said, love your neighbor, he meant it in all of the ways, no matter who your neighbor is or what struggles they might have. Now, the Skeleton Army only lasted about 10 years in their organized opposition because, of course, the Salvation Army itself would attract more and more people to it over time. Early on, there was a group of people who saw what William Booth was trying to do, and instead of being curious about why it is he was doing what he was doing, asking the question, well, why is it there are so many people out there that need this help? And why is the help not available to them? All the questions that William Booth was asking himself that led him to start this thing. There was another group of people who asked those same questions, and instead of acting out of their curiosity, acted out of their fear. Thankfully, for all of the people throughout the century and a half that would come after this time that the Salvation Army's been able to help, all the people it's been able to bring into sobriety, all the people it's been able to help clothe, all the people that have to feed, and yes, the number of people that they've been able to introduce to Christ in a new way. Thankfully for all of that, for all of them, curiosity won over fear. And while Herod, in the story today, if you keep reading, will act out of fear and act similarly as the Skeleton Army did, he will act violently out of his fear towards others. Herod's fear does not win. Mary's curiosity does. Jesus is born. He is raised. He does come here. He does teach us the way to live. He does go to the cross. And he does the thing for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. Somewhere along the way, we switch gears on our kids. And we stop encouraging them to be so curious. And we start telling them things like, curiosity killed the cat. Now, I don't really like cats. No, I'm just kidding. But somewhere around there, we do that. Somewhere there's a switch that happens where we decided that somehow curiosity is okay, but too much curiosity might be a bad thing. Because the truth is, absolutely, if we get curious about things, it may lead us somewhere that we do not plan to go. It may lead us somewhere that feels unpleasant at the time. It may lead us to, do crazy things like, leave your job and go to seminary and become a pastor. Curiosity, whether we are doing it out of interest because we're pursuing something good, or whether we are doing it out of deprivation because we want to figure out how to feel less bad. Curiosity is something unique to humans. It is a gift we've been given from God. It is our ability to look at the world and wonder why, wonder how it might be better, wonder why things are the way they are, and if they could possibly be different than the way they are. So much of the best things that have happened in human history, some of the best things when we are at our best and doing our best, it's when we are willing to ask those questions and help figure out the answers. We asked ourselves, throughout my time here, multiple times, how could we do such and such? If there's a need in our community, how do we address it? If there's a need in our church, how can we get out there and be part of it? If there is a need in life, if there's a way that we could learn to love God, neighbor, and ourselves a little better, how might we do that? I think as long as we continue to ask those questions, we will continue to be the healthy and amazing and vibrant church that we are. I think when the church stops asking those questions, stops asking how do we help people love God, neighbor, themselves more, that's where we get into trouble. Thankfully, we have a wonderful example, and her name is Mary, and she was the mother of Jesus. So this Christmas, let us remember all of the folks, all of the opportunities we have, all the different ways we could respond, and instead choose to respond, not like Herod, not being driven solely by our fear, but let us do our best to respond like Mary when something new or unexpected comes up, and wonder if this is maybe a time when God might be doing something new in my life or yours. Maybe this is the time that God's trying to teach us something we didn't already know. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to change the world in a little way, in the same way that Mary was able to change it in a very big way. Amen.
Amen.